In the 1950s, Britain built some of the most advanced bombers on Earth. Aircraft so radical, so far ahead of their time, that the Soviet Union struggled to counter them for years. Today, Europe builds none of that. No stealth bombers, no long-range strategic strike aircraft, nothing that even resembles what it once had. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States just unveiled its newest bomber.
The United States has unveiled its latest stealth bomber.
The United States Air Force has a new strategic long-range stealth bomber.
A machine so advanced it can slip through enemy airspace almost undetected. So here's the question that should bother you. If Europe once led the world in bomber technology, why did it simply stop? Was it money? Was it politics? Or did Europe lose the ability to build machines like this altogether? The real answer is more surprising than you'd expect, and it says less about what Europe can build and more about what Europe decided it needed. Let's go back to where this story actually begins. Chapter 1. Britain's Bomber Gamble. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand what a strategic bomber actually is. It isn't just a big plane that drops bombs. A strategic bomber is built to fly enormous distances, carry heavy payloads, and strike targets deep inside enemy territory, often without ever needing to land along the way. During the Cold War, that capability meant something very specific. It meant being able to deliver a nuclear weapon to Moscow or to Washington without warning. A strategic bomber wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. It told your enemy that no matter what they did, you could always hit back. That single idea, the guarantee of retaliation, is what nuclear strategists call deterrence. After the Second World War, Britain found itself in a strange and uncomfortable position. It had helped defeat Nazi Germany, yet it now faced a new and far more dangerous rival sitting just across Europe. The Soviet Union had a massive army and an expanding arsenal, and Britain, unlike the United States, was close enough to be hit hard and fast. London knew it couldn't outproduce Moscow in tanks or soldiers, so it turned to the sky. In 1947, the British government issued a requirement for a new class of bomber, one capable of flying at extreme altitude at high speed, carrying a nuclear weapon deep into Soviet territory. 3 separate manufacturers stepped up to answer that call, and instead of picking just one, Britain built all 3. That decision alone tells you something about how seriously Britain took this threat. It wasn't hedging its bets to save money, it was insurance against a single design failing at the worst possible moment. Chapter 2. The V-bombers. They were called the V-bombers, and together they formed the backbone of Britain's nuclear deterrent for nearly 2 decades. The first was the Vickers Valiant, which entered service in 1955. It was the workhorse of the group, simpler than its siblings, but reliable enough that it became the only V-bomber ever to drop a live nuclear weapon, and only during test detonations in the Pacific. Then came the Avro Vulcan in 1956, instantly recognizable by its huge, tailless delta wing, a design so unconventional for its era that it still turns heads at air shows today. And finally, the Handley Page Victor arrived in 1958, with a distinctive crescent-shaped wing and the largest bomb bay of the 3. Together, at their peak strength in June 1964, Britain fielded roughly 160 of these aircraft, around 50 Valiant, 70 Vulcans, and 39 Victors. For a brief moment, this small island nation possessed one of the most credible independent nuclear strike forces on the planet. And these were not crude machines. The V-bombers were designed to cruise at around 50,000 feet, well above the reach of most fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft guns of the time. The thinking was simple: fly high enough, fast enough, and nothing can touch you. For a few short years, that logic held. But history has a habit of turning yesterday's breakthrough into tomorrow's vulnerability. And that's exactly what happened next. Chapter 3. When the skies stopped being safe by the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Soviet air defense technology was evolving at a terrifying pace. Radar systems became sharper, surface-to-air missiles became faster and more accurate. The turning point came on May 1st, 1960, when a Soviet S-75 Diviner missile shot down an American U-2 spy plane flying at around 70,000 feet, an altitude that had once been considered untouchable. If a missile could reach that high, then altitude was no longer a shield. It was a death sentence. Britain's entire bomber strategy had just been quietly rendered obsolete. The V-Force adapted as best it could. Instead of flying high, the Vulcans and Victors switched to flying low, skimming just above the ground to slip beneath Soviet radar coverage. It worked for a while, but flying at low altitude put enormous physical stress on airframes that had never been designed for it. Cracks began appearing in the wings of the Valiant fleet from structural fatigue, and by 1965, barely a decade after entering service, the entire Valiant fleet had to be retired. It was an expensive, uncomfortable lesson. The very solution that kept the bombers relevant was also slowly tearing them apart. Chapter 4: The weapon that made bombers optional. At the same time, something else was changing that would matter even more than metal fatigue. A new kind of weapon was entering service, one that didn't need a pilot, didn't need to survive enemy airspace, and couldn't be intercepted by any fighter jet in existence. The submarine-launched ballistic missile. Britain acquired the Polaris missile system from the United States, mounted it on a new fleet of submarines, and by the late 1960s, those submarines quietly took over as Britain's primary nuclear deterrent. Think about the logic here. A submarine hidden somewhere in the depths of the ocean is nearly impossible to find, nearly impossible to strike first, and can always guarantee retaliation. A bomber, no matter how advanced, still has to survive a flight through enemy airspace to do the same job. Once Britain had a delivery system that solved deterrence more reliably and far more cheaply than a fleet of aging bombers, keeping those bombers as the nation's frontline nuclear force stopped making sense. That decision effectively marked the end of Britain's era as a strategic bomber power. The Vulcan continued flying in a conventional role for years, most famously during the 1982 Falklands War, when Vulcans staged an extraordinary long-range bombing raid on Port Stanley, refueled again and again by Victors converted into flying fuel tankers. But by 1984, the Vulcan was gone from frontline service, and the last Victor, having spent decades as a tanker rather than a bomber, was finally retired on October 15, 1993. Britain never built another strategic bomber to replace them. Its nuclear deterrent today rests entirely on submarines carrying Trident missiles. Chapter 5: France's different path. France, watching all of this unfold, reached a similar conclusion through a slightly different path. Under Charles de Gaulle, France built its own independent nuclear deterrent, one it insisted on controlling entirely by itself, outside of NATO's integrated command structure. France did briefly operate a dedicated bomber, the Mirage IV, as part of its early nuclear force. But rather than continuing to invest in ever larger, ever more expensive dedicated bombers, France chose a different route. It put its nuclear deterrent onto fast, multi-role fighter aircraft instead. Today, that mission belongs to the Rafale, armed with the ASMPA, a nuclear-tipped air-launched cruise missile with a range of roughly 500 kilometers, capable of striking from a standoff distance so the aircraft never has to fly directly over the most heavily defended part of a target. Pair that with France's fleet of Triomphant-class ballistic missile submarines, and you have a two-part nuclear deterrent, a dyad in strategic terms that never required building anything resembling a B-2 or a B-21. France didn't fall behind. It simply built its deterrent differently, spreading the mission across submarines and fighters rather than a dedicated bomber fleet. By the 1990s, both of Europe's nuclear powers had arrived at the same basic strategic decision. Submarines became the guaranteed, survivable core of nuclear deterrence. Fighter aircraft, missiles, and eventually drones handled everything else. And the Cold War itself was ending, so the immediate existential threat that had justified massive strategic bomber fleets was fading along with it. Chapter 6: Why America Never Stopped. This is really the core of the answer, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The United States never stopped building strategic bombers because the United States never stopped needing to project power across the entire planet. Unlike European nations whose primary security concerns sat right on their own continent, America's military commitments spanned the Pacific, the Middle East, and beyond. A bomber that can take off from Missouri and strike a target on the other side of the world isn't a luxury for the United States. It's a core requirement of how American military strategy actually works. And America didn't just keep building bombers, it kept reinventing them. The B-52, first flown in the 1950s, is still flying combat missions today, a testament to just how adaptable that airframe proved to be. The B-1B Lancer followed in the 1980s, trading altitude for speed and a lower radar profile. But the real leap came with the B-2 Spirit, which entered service in the 1990s. The B-2 didn't just try to fly above enemy defenses or beneath enemy radar, it tried to disappear from them entirely. Stealth technology, in simple terms, works by making an aircraft extremely difficult for radar to detect. It isn't invisibility, it's closer to camouflage for radio waves. The B-2's distinctive flying wing shape, with no sharp angles or vertical tail fin, scatters radar signals away from their source instead of bouncing them straight back. It's an extraordinary capability, and it came with an extraordinary price tag. According to United States Government Accountability Office figures, each B-2 cost more than $2 billion once total program expenses are factored in. One of the most expensive aircraft ever built on a per-unit basis. Only 21 were ever produced. Chapter 7. The next generation. That cost is precisely why the story doesn't end with the B-2. Enter the B-21 Raider, Northrop Grumman's newest stealth bomber, which took its first test flight on November 10, 2023. The B-21 borrows the same flying wing concept as the B-2, but was designed from the very beginning around digital engineering, letting engineers test and refine the aircraft's performance in simulation before a single physical part was built. That approach is expected to make the B-21 dramatically cheaper to produce and maintain than its predecessor, while offering stealth capabilities that are, according to Northrop Grumman and the US Air Force, more advanced still. The Air Force plans to build at least 100 of them, with the first operational aircraft set to be based at Ellsworth Air Force Base. The B-21 isn't just a new plane. It's a statement that the United States considers long-range strategic bombing central to its military strategy for decades to come. Chapter 8. The real answer. So where does that leave Europe? Here's the twist that changes how you should think about this entire story. Europe never lost the technology or the industrial capability to build a strategic bomber. Airbus BAE Systems and Dassault Aviation are among the most capable aerospace manufacturers in the world, responsible for some of the most advanced fighter jets, satellites, and defense systems on the planet. If European governments decided tomorrow that they needed a stealth bomber of their own, the underlying engineering expertise to attempt it already exists across the continent. What doesn't exist is the same strategic incentive that drives American investment. Europe isn't fighting for global reach across every ocean on Earth. Its security priorities sit closer to home, and within NATO's structure of shared responsibility, the alliance's most expensive and most demanding capability, intercontinental strategic bombing, has always had an obvious provider already in place: the United States. So instead of bombers, European nations have poured their money into advanced fighter aircraft, submarines, long-range missiles, drone technology, and increasingly sophisticated air defense systems, tools better suited to the threats sitting directly on their own doorstep. Conclusion. So this is the real answer, and it isn't the one the title suggests. Europe isn't stuck in the 1950s. Europe simply looked at a different map, faced a different set of threats, and made a different calculation about where its money was best spent. The V-bombers weren't a failure. They were a solution built for a specific moment in history, a moment that eventually passed. What replaced them wasn't European weakness, it was European choice.
And as the security landscape in Europe continues to shift, that choice may not be permanent. The technology never disappeared, it's simply been waiting for a reason to come back.